The basket dragged at Sandra Ross's ribs with every step, damp linen weight pressing the breath from her lungs as she crossed the public coaching yard at Harrogate before dawn had fully lifted. The stones were slick from night rain. Her split shoes drank the cold through at once. She felt each seam give under her toes. Horses stamped in their traces, coachmen shouted for trunks, and two fishmongers stood laughing beside a cart of eels while they watched her stumble and recover and keep moving as if she had not noticed their eyes. She had tied the mended garments in neat bundles, collar points aligned, cuffs turned proper, thread knots hidden where no lady should ever see them. But her fingers had gone stiff in the wet, and the top bundle slid. She caught it against her chest before it fell in mud. The motion sent a thin knife of pain through her wrists, where yesterday's lie had eaten the skin, pink and raw. Behind her, the Ross carriage door stayed closed. Lady Ross had ordered that it remain so. Sandra was to walk beside the wheel with the deliveries, while her stepmother rode inside on cushions, warm under a lap blanket trimmed with sable, because a plain girl in a worn dress was useful when there was labour to be displayed, and embarrassing when there was comfort to be shared. A footman she recognised from the Habersham household glanced from Sandra's patched sleeve to the lacquered Ross crest on the coach, and then looked quickly away. That look was worse than open staring. It was the look reserved for a fact everybody understood and no one intended to name. Sandra adjusted her grip and kept her shoulders level. Hunger made her mouth flood with bitter saliva. She pressed her teeth into the inside of her cheek until the urge to shake passed. She had not been given breakfast. Lady Ross had said broth was wasted on girls who confused diligence with entitlement. By the first hour after sunrise, the yard had swollen with traffic and voices, and Sandra had delivered 3 parcels to houses that paid Lady Ross in coin she never touched. At the pump alcove behind the ostler's sheds, where moss climbed the brick and the drain ran black from hoof-wash, she set down the basket and braced both palms on the basin rim until the dizziness eased. The pump handle screeched. Water came hard and iron cold. She let it strike her hands, then hissed through her teeth when it found the cracked ridges across her knuckles. Lye burns, needle punctures, the ridge where a pan edge had torn skin 2 nights ago. She counted the day by pain because numbers held steady when people did not. 2 loads of linen still to carry, 4 shirts to collar by noon. Hemming for Lady Agnes's tea gown before supper. Polish silver if cook did not intervene. Mend Eliza Ross's riding habit, where she had split it climbing a gate, though Eliza would say she had never worn the thing and accused Sandra of clumsiness while handing it over. Sandra bent, splashed water on her face and held still while the cold settled into her scalp and down her spine. Her stomach cramped so sharply she doubled once, quietly, and breathed until the wave passed. She had learned to make no sound when she hurt. Sound invited remark invited inspection invited punishment for dramatics. The alcove smelled of whetstone and horse sweat and metal. No one came there unless they needed water quickly. For 1 minute she had no audience, and in that minute she permitted herself 1 private inventory beyond cuts and chores. She was 22 years old. Her gown had been turned twice and mended 3 times. Her hair had slipped loose from its pins because she had no maid to set it. She had 1 pair of gloves with fingers gone. She had a father who had taught her to draw columns straight and never falsify a total. She had a mother's face she now recalled mostly by lamplight and varnish because the portrait had been removed from the drawing-room before the funeral lilies had wilted. She dried her hands on her apron and picked up the basket again before anyone could ask why she had stopped. Lady Ross chose that moment to emerge from the carriage with a rustle of dove-grey silk and a veil pinned at precisely the angle of bereavement that still suggested appetite for admiration. Her perfume reached the alcove before her voice did, lavender with a sweet edge that turned sharp in Sandra's throat. "Miss Ross, you're back." Sandra straightened at once, though the basket strap had dug a groove into her shoulder and the movement sent sparks through her neck. Lady Ross stepped closer, gloved fingertips settling briefly at the base of Sandra's spine and pressing as if she adjusted a mannequin. "You present like hired help in a cattle market. Lift your chin. If people must look, let them conclude discipline rather than neglect." Two women at the draper's entrance paused, pretending to study ribbon while listening. Sandra held her chin where she was told. "Yes, ma'am." Lady Ross inspected the top bundle, found no flaw to seize, and moved to the next offence. "You ate yesterday at dusk. You will not eat again until this route is complete. Hunger improves speed, and idleness has made you soft." Sandra kept her eyes on the basket, weave. She had scrubbed floors before midnight, stitched until the candle guttered, risen while the house was still black, but contradiction would be read as insolence, and insolence had a tariff. Lady Ross tilted her head, voice lowering just enough to sharpen. "Do not mistake my tolerance for affection. Your father left obligations. I inherited them. You are one." The words landed with the clean force of a ledger stamp. Debt, due, transferable. Lady Ross turned to the waiting groom. "If she faints, throw water and continue." Then she smiled for the yard as if she had dispensed kind counsel and resumed her seat inside the carriage, where the curtain fell and cut Sandra from view like a dismissed servant. Sandra resumed the circuit through Harrowgate's morning streets, moving from cookshop steam to draper's starch to the sour alley behind the chandlery, where she handed over cuffs and accepted no thanks, because thanks were addressed to Lady Ross's account. She had once entered these houses by the front steps with her father, who knew rents and roof timbers and tenant names by memory, who had carried peppermint lozenges in a tin and slipped one into her palm before every call as if sweetness were a formal requirement of business. He had died in late autumn, with ink on his thumb and apology in his mouth, lungs failing before he could finish the sentence that began with "Forgive me." Within a week, Lady Ross had taken the house keys from the butler and the account books from the steward, citing prudence and masculine incompetence, and no one had challenged her because she spoke briskly, paid 2 urgent creditors in public, and let the parish see 1 large donation at Christmas. The entail swallowed land that should have steadied them. The loans called in by men who had smiled at the funeral did the rest. Sandra had watched her mother's portrait carried out between 2 footmen as if it were damaged furniture. She had stood in the hall and not moved because movement would have become pleading, and pleading before servants never returned dignity once spent. So she learned to work where no one thought to look. Needlework first, because torn things did not wait for grief. Then figures at night by candle stub, copying wheat yields and lease arrears from memory into a narrow notebook hidden behind a loose attic board, proving to herself that the estate had been badly bled, not naturally ruined. Endurance was not surrender. She repeated that while her fingers cramped, while wax burned down to her nail, while the house slept and Lady Ross dreamed behind locked doors in the chamber that had been her mother's. Near midday she returned to the yard for the last trunk of clean household linen and found the crowd thicker, sunlight pale as watered milk on coach roofs, mud churned to ruts, boys darting between wheels with baskets of rolls she could not afford. Her hands had begun to tremble in that small, treacherous way they did when hunger tipped toward faintness. She tucked them under the linen, hid the shaking, and crossed toward the carriage. Lady Ross's younger daughter, Miss Georgina, stood with a sugared bun half eaten and looked Sandra over with candid dislike. "You smell of soap and horse." Sandra inclined her head. "I have been working, miss." Georgina laughed and turned away. A merchant's wife nearby murmured to her companion, not quietly enough, "That is the stepdaughter. I had heard she was plain." Plain was safer than pretty. Plain invited underestimation. Plain passed unguarded through rooms where truths lived in account books and pantry locks and wage lists. Still, the word pricked. Sandra set down the basket to lift the trunk. The lid caught her index finger and split skin at the knuckle. Blood welled bright, then ran thin with pump water as she wiped it on her apron before anyone could call attention. Lady Ross leaned from the carriage window just enough for voice, not face. "Do not stain the linen. If you ruin one cuff, you will mend 30. "Yes, ma'am." Sandra lifted again. The trunk rose. Her arms shook. She held it steady to the step. No one offered help. No one was expected to. When the last parcel was secured, Lady Ross gave a small nod toward the coachman. "We return. Miss Ross will walk behind. She has not earned the seat." The carriage lurched forward. Sandra followed in its wake, mud spotting the hems she had patched at midnight, fingers throbbing, stomach hollow as a scraped bowl. At the turn toward Ross House, she glanced once at the upper windows where her mother's portrait had hung and then looked down at the road, counting breaths, counting steps, counting what still remained in her power, her hands, her figures, the truth she kept hidden in a notebook no one had yet found. She kept her gaze on the rutted road and matched her stride to the grinding turn of the carriage wheels until the Ross gates came into view. Iron bars beaded with old rain, stone posts greened by moss, where her father had once insisted they be scrubbed each spring. The coach rolled through without slowing. Sandra stepped around a puddle the size of a basin and nearly lost the left sole of her shoe to the sucking mud. At the front steps, Lady Ross descended with practised fragility, one gloved hand on the footman's sleeve, then glanced back only to say, "The trunk to the sewing room, the linen to Mrs. Pike, then report to the breakfast room and clear what remains." What remained was always crusts and cold tea. Sandra curtsied because refusal had no function that did not end in hunger. She dragged the trunk through the side passage where heat from the kitchens never reached, and set it down beside the mending table she used when servants slept. The house smelled of beeswax, coal smoke, and lavender sachets that Lady Ross tucked into every visible drawer as if scent could stand in for kindness. As Sandra untied each bundle, she could feel the old arithmetic of her life pressing against her ribs as hard as the basket had pressed an hour before, her mother dead at 14 after a winter fever that took 3 neighbouring children and left the nursery silent. Her father grey at the temples, and gentle in his grief, remarrying within 18 months because tenants needed stability, because creditors preferred married men, because a widower with a daughter and too much land looked vulnerable at market. Lady Ross arriving with 2 daughters, 6 trunks, and a smile that never reached her eyes. House keys changing hands the week after vows were exchanged. Staff replaced one by one with people who owed loyalty to Lady Ross rather than to the house. Sandra had not understood strategy then. She had called it adjustment. She understood now. Every cupboard inventory had shifted. Every account request had been delayed. Every door that once stood open acquired a lock. Her father had still believed he could outwork any damage. He had ridden boundary lines in sleet, negotiated loan extensions in market inns, sold timber he meant to keep, and returned each night with mud on his boots and apology in his voice, saying next quarter would settle matters. Then late autumn took his breath in increments, not all at once, and he died in the blue room with church bells ringing for someone else's wedding, while Lady Ross stood at the foot of the bed and asked the solicitor where the ready cash had been placed. By the time the lilies from his funeral browned at the edges, the ready cash had vanished into household obligations. The tenants had received notices drafted in a new hand, and Sandra's place in her own home had narrowed from daughter to unpaid utility. Mrs. Pike, the housekeeper, met her in the corridor with a basket of napkins and eyes that had gone permanently tired from watching what she could not stop. "You are bleeding again," she said under her breath, not unkindly, as Sandra shifted the trunk. Sandra tucked her hand behind the linen. "It will close." Mrs. Pike paused, listening for footsteps, then slipped a heel of bread into Sandra's apron pocket so quickly it felt like a secret handshake. "Eat where no one can see." Sandra nodded once. Gratitude in this house needed to be silent to survive. She reached the breakfast room and found the table stripped of anything warm except one pot with a skin of cooling fat on top, and 2 plates carrying the crescent bites her stepsisters had left. Eliza sat at the window in a morning wrapper of pale blue silk, turning her wrist so a bracelet caught the light. Sandra recognized it at once. Her mother's garnet links, reset with cheaper stones and polished until they looked newly purchased. Georgina leaned over the chair back, reading a circulating novel aloud in a bored tone until she saw Sandra and snapped the book shut. "There she is. Lady Ross says the Green Police needs pressing, and you are not to scorch the sleeves this time." Sandra moved toward the table to clear the cups. Eliza lifted one finger. "Not that tray first, mine last. The silver marks if she stacks poorly." They spoke about her as if she had no ears, and she had learned to let words pass over her like sleet over stone. But hunger thinned that discipline. She set the cups down carefully and answered, "The silver marks when left in damp, miss, not when stacked dry." Georgina laughed with open delight at the risk Sandra had taken. "Hear her. We have an expert in metallurgy now." Eliza's mouth tightened. "You have opinions for someone who owns nothing." Sandra lowered her eyes and held her spine straight. "Owns nothing." The phrase carried legal accuracy. The entail had swallowed title land before she could inherit. Her mother's jewellery had become household assets by marriage transfer. Her father's books had been sold in lots, save 3 volumes Lady Ross considered too dull to fetch value. Even her winter cloak had become Georgina's after one sleeve tore, and Sandra had watched the maid carry it downstairs, while Lady Ross said a torn garment on a plain girl invited pity, and pity invited gossip. Debts had done what cruelty alone could not, made confiscation look prudent. When solicitors came, Lady Ross received them in the drawing-room with tea and sympathy, explaining that the late Mr. Ross had been generous beyond reason and left women to clean the wreckage. She had shown select ledgers with lines rearranged, wages delayed, rents advanced in ways that favoured her story. Sandra had seen enough columns at her father's elbow to know which figures lied. She had also learned what happened when she said so. Once, in the first month after the funeral, she had pointed to a duplicated grain payment and asked if it were an error. Lady Ross had smiled without warmth and answered, "Children who meddle in accounts become children who sleep in attics." That night, Sandra's room key no longer fit her door. By supper, she had been moved upstairs beneath the eaves where winter wind came through the frame, and the bell pull did not work. Lady Ross summoned her before noon to the small drawing-room where the curtains were kept half-closed to preserve upholstery. The rustle of silk announced her before Sandra entered. Eliza sat on the chaise with embroidery she did not touch. Georgina examined hat ribbons laid out like surgical instruments. Lady Ross remained standing near the mantel, one hand resting on a ledger bound in dark calfskin that had once belonged to Sandra's father. "You will accompany us to the Draper's Arcade after luncheon," she said. "Miss Eliza requires the ivory muslin altered at once. You will carry it and wait." Sandra kept her hands folded to hide their roughness. "Yes, ma'am." Lady Ross opened the ledger and tapped a page. "You asked last week for lamp oil for your attic." "No." Sandra did not let her gaze rise. "I asked because the corridor lantern was removed." "You asked because idleness breeds vanity. You read when you should sleep, and then you work poorly." The lie was thin. Sandra worked through each night because there was no other time. Eliza looked up from the unused embroidery and smiled, as if offering charity. "If you are desperate for occupation, you may darn my stockings. The silk tears at the heel and your own are beyond saving in any case." Georgina lifted a ribbon against her throat. "Do you remember the pearl comb your father promised for my coming out, Mamma? Sandra misplaced it." Sandra swallowed. She had not misplaced it. The comb had been in her mother's dressing box until Lady Ross locked the cabinet and redistributed its contents across two daughters who called inheritance a gift from fate. She could still see the comb's carved shell teeth catching candlelight on her mother's dark hair. "I do not know where it is, miss." Lady Ross closed the ledger with a soft thud. "Then do not speak of what you do not know. Another matter. Mr. Fenwick called this morning regarding arrears on the North lease. You will say nothing to staff. Panic reduces productivity." Sandra answered, "Yes, ma'am," while heat climbed her throat because she knew the arrears were manufactured, rents recorded as unpaid, though Mrs. Colton had delivered coin in person 10 days earlier. Sandra had entered the amount in her hidden notebook from memory the moment she returned to the attic. She had every tenant payment for 6 months written in a tight hand beneath loose floorboard splinters. Not proof enough for court. Enough for truth. Enough to keep her father's voice intact in one corner of the world. Lady Ross stepped closer and adjusted Sandra's collar as if correcting a child. The touch landed on the bruise at her wrist. Sandra did not flinch. "Stand straighter in public. You represent this family, whether you deserve it or not." Georgina snorted softly. Eliza did not look up. Sandra kept her tone level. "I understand." Lady Ross's eyes moved over her face with that familiar mixture of assessment and contempt. "Do you? Your father mistook affection for governance. I do not. Debt is managed, not indulged." The words were not new, yet each repetition tightened the same invisible cord. Sandra curtsied and backed from the room, carrying orders and silence in equal measure. When she reached the attic, in the thin hour between luncheon service and departure, she shut the door with her heel, slid the bread from her pocket, and ate standing by the window where leaded pains fogged from her breath. The crust was stale enough to scrape her gums, and it tasted better than most meals she had known that winter. Beneath the narrow bed, under the loosened board near the leg, her notebook waited wrapped in old muslin to keep soot off the pages. She knelt, ignoring the pull in her shoulders, and opened to yesterday's columns. Tenant rents received, coal deliveries delayed, wage chits marked, paid in the household ledger, but never handed to the maids whose hands chapped in the same wash water as hers. She added today's entry from memory, Fenwick's claim, Lady Ross's warning, the missing North lease sum, and drew a small cross in the margin where numbers conflicted with the house books. Her father had taught her that figures were promises in ink. Break enough promises and roofs fell, wells poisoned, fields lay empty. Lady Ross treated figures as costumes, useful for the audience at hand. Sandra copied anyway. not because she believed rescue would ride up the drive, not because any magistrate had asked, because keeping a true account was the one form of obedience she still offered the dead. Outside her window, the stable clock struck 1, each bell note dulled by mist. She wrapped the notebook again, replaced the board, and pressed it flat with her palm until it sat flush. Then she stood, retied the frayed ribbon at her throat, and descended to the passage where footsteps already moved with the day's next command. Lady Ross's voice carried from below, crisp as snapped thread. "Miss Ross, the carriage is waiting. Do not keep your betters standing." Sandra placed her bleeding hand over the banister, straightened and went down. The front hall swallowed her at once, dim after the white yard light, and gave her back to duty before her eyes had adjusted. Mrs. Pike thrust a folded shawl into her arms, then the parcel of ivory muslin wrapped in brown paper and twine, then Eliza's gloves she was to carry, though she would never be permitted to wear. Lady Ross moved ahead through the side door with both daughters arranged behind her like costly ornaments, silk brushing silk, perfume soft and false in the close passage. Sandra followed with the parcels balanced against her ribs, her left knuckle throbbing where the trunk had split skin. The carriage stood ready in the gravel, bays blowing steam into the wet afternoon. She climbed to the back step before anyone told her where to stand. No one invited her inside. The coach jolted through town at a pace too fast for comfort and too slow for mercy, wheels striking every rut, the iron strap of the rear rail pressing cold through her glove into her palm. By the time the chapel bell near Market Cross struck 2, rain had begun again in thin, slanting lines that darkened wool and soaked bonnet ribbons and made every cobble shine like old bone. Harrowgate's Draper's Arcade offered shelter only in theory. Water ran from the roofline in steady threads and gathered in shallow pools along the flagstones. Shopfront glass held blurred reflections of passing hats and moving coach lamps. Lady Ross descended first, receiving a draper's bow as if she had done him a favour by appearing. Eliza took her arm. Georgina followed with a sigh at the weather. Sandra stepped down last, parcel pressed to her chest, and stood one pace behind, while Lady Ross inspected bolts of imported lace she had no intention of buying at full price. Orders came without turning. Carry this. Hold that. Not there. Do not drip on the carpet. She moved as told between tables crowded with ribbons and trimmings, hearing herself discussed in the margins of other voices. Poor relation, companion, perhaps. No, lower than that. She kept her face still. A girl who reacted gave strangers sport. The intrusion came with a hard thud and a small cry cut short by breathless panic. A child struck her full force at the waist, silk and bones and wet curls, then clung as if the floor had become water beneath her feet. Sandra staggered back one step, caught the parcel against her own body, and dropped her free hand to steady narrow shoulders shaking under soaked satin. The child's dress had split from waist to hem along the side seam, ivory silk gaping over petticoat and stays, embroidery torn where someone had grabbed and missed. Her cheeks burned with shame, hotter than fever, and she kept saying one word between quick breaths. "Papa! Papa!" People turned. Of course they turned. Shopgirls paused with pins in their mouths. A gentleman by the glove counter stepped away as if distress might stain his sleeve. The child tried to pull the torn panels closed with both fists and failed. Her lip trembled. "He told me to wait. I did wait. They laughed." Sandra knelt without thought, because kneeling brought her level with terror and made her voice less frightening to small ears. "Look at me," she said quietly. "You are safe for this minute. Hold still." She slipped Eliza's gloves and her own shawl around the girl's middle to hide the split seam from the crowd, fingers moving by habit through wet fabric and loose thread, measuring damage even as her heart beat too quickly. The tear had run with the grain. A simple whip stitch would pucker and fail. It needed recutting beneath the embellishment, or the next movement would rip it wider. Lady Ross hissed her name from somewhere behind, low and warning, but Sandra did not rise. The child's hands were ice cold and slick with rain. "What is your name?" Sandra asked. "Clara," the girl whispered. "Do not make me go out like this." "Mamma's dress was this one." Boot beats struck stone from the arcade entrance, sharp and deliberate, followed by the metallic jolt of bridles checked hard. Conversation thinned as if someone had drawn air from the corridor. A man's voice cut through the wet noise with military economy. "Stop!" The single word reached every corner. Footmen shifted. Merchants withdrew 2 paces. Mounted guards in dark cloaks parted at the threshold, and through that opening came the Duke of Blackthorn, rain-dark greatcoat broad across the shoulders, hat-brim dripping, scar pale against one side of his jaw where old damage pulled faintly when he clenched his teeth. He dismounted before the groom fully took his reins. Boots hit stone. He crossed the distance in 6 strides that made room around him without a hand laid on anyone. His eyes found the child first, then the torn silk, then Sandra's blood-bright knuckle where the rain had washed away dried rust and left the skin raw. Those eyes were the colour of winter water under cloud. They did not soften. He took Clara by both shoulders, not rough, not gentle, checking her as if for fractures. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head and began to cry in earnest from relief. "It tore. They saw." His jaw tightened. He looked at the ruined seam and then at the draper, who had appeared with bows and apologies that tripped over each other. "A private room," the Duke said. "Now!" The draper wrung his hands. "Your Grace, of course, but the head modiste is with Lady Penford and—" "Now!" Sandra rose because kneeling before a duke in a public shop was one danger, and remaining there was another. She stepped back, hands empty except for thread scents, and the small girl's shame now wrapped in borrowed wool. Lady Ross arrived at her shoulder in a rustle of silk and indignation carefully masked as concern. "Your Grace, what an unfortunate disturbance. The child collided with my stepdaughter. Miss Ross has no training for delicate garments. If you permit, I shall send for Madame Bisset from Queen Street." He did not look at Lady Ross. He looked at Sandra. "Can you mend it?" The question landed like a dropped weight. She heard the warning in Lady Ross's breath before she felt fingers close on her wrist exactly where old bruising had not yet faded. "Miss Ross will not presume," Lady Ross said smoothly. "She is serviceable with household linen. Court dress is another matter." Sandra's throat went tight, not from fear of the Duke, but from the child still clutching the shawl closed with white knuckles. Clara watched her as if answers had become oxygen. Sandra met the Duke's gaze once, then lowered it to the seam. "Not as it is," she said. The tear followed tension from a poor fitting at the waist. A surface stitch will fail before supper. It must be recut beneath the trim and reinforced at the panel. Silence held for one breath too long. Rain ticked from the roof. Lady Ross's nails pressed harder into Sandra's skin. The Duke's voice cooled another degree. "You are correcting my daughter's dressmaker?" Sandra kept her hands still. "I am naming what the cloth will do, Your Grace." His eyes narrowed slightly, measuring insolence or competence, perhaps both. "Insolent." The word struck like a slap in open air. Clara flinched. Sandra did not. "Accurate, Your Grace." She heard Lady Ross suck in a sharp breath as if scandal had acquired a body. Around them, witnesses leaned closer, under the pretence of selecting ribbon. The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his stillness did. Not warmer, more attentive. He glanced to the draper. "Your workroom." Yes, Your Grace, through the rear door." Lady Ross tightened her hold. "Miss Ross cannot leave my side. She is under my authority." Then at last he turned toward her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Your name." "Lady Ross." "I did not ask your title for admiration. Release her wrist." People heard it. People would repeat it before dusk. Lady Ross's smile appeared and fractured at once, thin as cracked porcelain. She removed her hand. Red marks bloomed where her fingers had been. The Duke's gaze dropped to them, then returned to Sandra's face. "You are bleeding," he said, as if entering one more fact into a ledger. "From earlier." "It is nothing!" "Liar!" The word was quiet. Worse for that. "Your knuckles are split. Your cuff is stiff with old blood. You are shaking from hunger." He shifted his attention to the nearest guard. "Bring broth, bread, hot, immediately." Lady Ross laughed once, a brittle sound with no humour in it. "Your Grace is generous to those who dramatise. Miss Ross is prone to weakness when work is expected." Sandra felt heat climb her throat. Humiliation and anger braided too tight to separate. She wished absurdly for her hidden attic and a stub of candle and numbers that did not sneer. Instead she stood in wet stockings under a duke's scrutiny, while strangers weighed her worth by posture and accent and the condition of her sleeves. Clara's fingers found her hand and held on. The Duke looked at Lady Ross as if she were a stain he had decided not to step in. "If she faints while your carriage is displayed in every yard from here to the moor, it will not be called weakness. It will be called evidence." His gaze returned to Sandra. "Take the child, move! Command as shelter." She recognised it only because she had spent years learning the opposite. She followed the draper through a narrow passage that smelled of starch, damp wool, and scorched pressing cloth. Clara stayed close, shoulders still trembling. Behind them came bootsteps that did not hurry and never lost distance. The Duke, one guard, Lady Ross protesting in clipped whispers, Eliza and Georgina rustling in offended silence. The rear workroom was small, warm, and lit by two high windows blurred with rain. Dress forms stood along one wall like waiting women with no faces. A long table held shears, chalk, and pins sorted in shallow trays. The draper's assistant stared as if she had walked into a sermon mid-sin. "Needle," Sandra said. "Fine silk thread, wax. And if you have it, narrow lawn for a hidden stay." The assistant looked to the Duke, not to her. He gave one nod. Tools arrived at once. Clara stood on the fitting stool while Sandra loosened the side seam with careful fingers, speaking low so only the child could hear. "Breathe slowly. Lift your arm. Good. Again." The silk was costly and unforgiving. One wrong cut would make the wound larger. She felt the room watching each movement, the arithmetic of class and risk and consequence aligning around her shoulders. Lady Ross took position by the doorway, lips pressed thin. "This is reckless," she said. "If she ruins it, I shall not be held liable." No one answered, only rain on glass, only thread drawn through wax with a soft pull. The Duke stood opposite Sandra, hands clasped behind him, coat still shedding water to the floorboards. Up close, the scar at his jaw looked older than gossip claimed, not a duelling mark, but something torn and healed under poor conditions. His face stayed carved from restraint. His daughter leaned towards Sandra each time a pin came near, trusting despite herself. Sandra set the pincushion down and reached for the shears. "Do not cut," Lady Ross snapped. "You will destroy the line." Sandra did not look up. "The line is already destroyed." Lady Ross stepped forward. "Miss Ross, you forget yourself." "Enough," the Duke said. One word, stone on stone. Lady Ross stopped. Sandra took one breath and made the cut exactly where the strain had begun, beneath the decorative braid where repair could hide if her hands stayed steady. The room seemed to tilt around that tiny sound of silk separating. Clara sucked in air. Sandra anchored the panel with her thumb, folded allowance inward, and began the new seam in small, even stitches that crossed and locked and disappeared into the fabric grain. Her fingers remembered what hunger tried to erase. Her father had once placed scrap velvet and old muslin before her at the kitchen table and said cloth told truth if one listened with touch, not pride. Coarse cloth lied less. Fine cloth punished arrogance. She worked as if he stood at her shoulder now, counting not cost but care. A bowl of broth arrived in a servant's shaking hands, then bread, steam rising into the close room. The guard set both on the table edge, within reach. Sandra did not pause. Clara whispered, "You should eat." Sandra shook her head slightly. "When you are done." The child straightened, as if that answer required bravery from both of them. The Duke watched in silence long enough for candle drips in the hallway, sconce to thicken and bend. At last he spoke, not to Lady Ross, not to the room, to Sandra. "You have done this before." She tied off one row and started the next. "Yes, Your Grace." "For whom?" "For whoever needed the seam to hold." His gaze rested on her bent head, on the mended cuff, on the wrist where fresh red finger marks darkened by the minute. He said nothing more. The rain eased outside to a softer hiss. Somewhere in the arcade a carriage rolled away and another arrived, wheels grinding grit. Inside the workroom all sound narrowed to breath, thread, and the small determined movements of a young woman who had been told all day that she was a debt and was now, under every eye in Harrogate worth fearing, being treated as if her hands might yet decide the evening. When the final hidden stay was in place and the decorative braid laid flat over truth, Sandra smoothed the silk once from waist to hem and stepped back. "Move your arm, miss," she told Clara. The child lifted, turned, bent. The seam held. Clara looked down in astonishment, then up at her father with wet lashes and a face transformed by relief. "It does not pull!" The Duke's eyes did not leave Sandra. "No," he said, "it does not." The draper exhaled as if he had been holding breath for an hour. The assistant clasped both hands to her apron. Even Lady Ross did not speak for several seconds, as though the fact of the holding seam had interrupted the order of things she depended upon. Clara touched the repaired side of her gown with careful fingertips. "May I breathe now?" Sandra managed a small nod. "Yes, miss. Deeply, if you please." The child drew one breath, then another, and the tremor in her shoulders eased by degrees. The Duke moved at last, not toward his daughter, but toward the table where the broth stood cooling. He lifted the bowl and held it out to Sandra. "Drink." She looked at the bowl, then at Clara. "After I secure the inner stitches at the waist, Your Grace. If she sits in the carriage too quickly, the weight may pull." His hand stayed where it was. "Drink first." Clara answered for her, voice hoarse from crying. "Papa, please let her finish. It pinches here if she does not." The Duke's jaw flexed against the old scar. He set the bowl down without argument. "Finish!" Sandra bent again over the seam, adding 3 tight anchoring stitches under the braid where no eye would find them. Her fingers felt clumsy now that the immediate urgency had passed. Hunger came roaring back when she allowed herself to notice it. She tied off the final thread and clipped the tail with the small shears. "There," she said softly. "Now you may drink." And then she must. The Duke did not repeat himself. He took up the bowl again. Sandra accepted it with both hands and swallowed too fast, burning her tongue, then forced herself to slow because spilling would be another humiliation she could not afford. Salt and fat hit her empty stomach like heat poured into ice. Her knees weakened once. She steadied. Lady Ross recovered her voice with brittle elegance. "A touching tableau. If this necessity has ended, Miss Ross will return with me. We have obligations." Clara's fingers tightened around Sandra's sleeve. "No!" Lady Ross did not look at the child. She looked at the Duke, smiling with practised regret. "She is merely overwrought. Children form attachments in moments of distress. It is not prudent to indulge servant familiarity." Sandra opened her mouth to correct the word servant and closed it again. Pride did not feed or shelter. Pride had to be spent where it bought something. The Duke's gaze stayed on Clara's face. "You are trembling." "I am cold," Clara whispered, "and tired." He turned toward the draper. "A private carriage entrance?" "Behind the counting room, Your Grace." "Prepare mine." He shifted his attention to Sandra. "You will accompany her to Blackthorn House to ensure the seam survives dressing." Lady Ross stepped forward at once. "That is not possible." "Everything is possible," he said. "Some things are merely inconvenient." "She is under my protection." The words hung in the warm workroom and rang false. Sandra felt it land in every listening ear. The Duke turned his head fractionally toward Lady Ross, eyes flat as winter sky. "Protection leaves different marks than those at her wrist." Lady Ross's cheeks lost colour, then flushed. "You overstep, Your Grace." He did not blink. "I do not." A guard opened the rear door. Damp air touched the room. The Duke lifted his daughter into his arms without flourish and settled her against his shoulder beneath his coat. Clara, still clutching Sandra's cuff, reached back until Sandra placed one hand lightly at the child's spine. "Move," he said. They crossed the narrow passage in a small procession. Guard first, then the Duke with Clara, Sandra beside him, carrying the work basket and the wrapped shawl, Lady Ross following in rustling indignation with Eliza and Georgina, whispering behind her. Outside, rain had thinned to mist, but the stones remained slick. A stable boy held the Blackthorn carriage door open. The crest on the panel was scored by old weather and still looked severe. Lady Ross moved for the door. The Duke blocked her with a glance. "Not this carriage!" Her voice sharpened. "You presume to separate me from my stepdaughter." "I presume to keep my daughter warm." He looked to the second carriage behind them, a hired Ross coach with mud on the wheels. "Your household may follow." Lady Ross's nostrils flared. "Miss Ross comes with me." Clara made a low sound against her father's coat. "No, Papa, please." Sandra felt the plea as a pull inside her own ribs. Lady Ross's eyes found her face, warning plain as struck steel. There would be punishment later for any public defiance that cost Lady Ross advantage. There was always punishment. Sandra tasted the broth still at the back of her throat and made her choice. "She should not be moved again between coaches," Sandra said, voice steady. "The fabric is wet and she is chilled. If she changes conveyance twice, she will shiver harder." Lady Ross gave a short laugh. "Now she offers medical counsel." Sandra kept her gaze lowered and did not retract one word. "I offer practical counsel, ma'am." The Duke extended his hand towards Sandra, palm up, not touching. "Inside!" She stepped up before fear could reorder her limbs. The carriage smelled of wet wool, leather, and faint cedar polish. Clara sat between them, wrapped in the Duke's coat and Sandra's shawl, breathing too quickly. As the carriage lurched into motion, the child leaned towards Sandra without asking and rested her forehead against Sandra's shoulder. Outside, wheels hissed over wet cobbles. hooves struck steady rhythm. Through the glass, Harrogate blurred into grey shop fronts and black umbrellas. Sandra kept one hand at Clara's back and counted breaths under her own, matching the child's pace to slower numbers the way she used to calm, skittish foals in her father's lower field. 4 in, she murmured. Hold! 4 out. Clara obeyed after 2 tries. Will they laugh tonight? Not at your seam, Sandra said. I meant at me. Sandra hesitated. Truth had edges. People laugh when they are frightened of what they cannot control. That does not make them correct. The Duke looked across at her, unreadable. You speak as if from experience. She folded the wet edge of the shawl away from Clara's throat. Yes, Your Grace. By the time the carriage turned through Blackthorn's gates, the rain had stopped entirely, and pale, late light lay over the long gravel drive like watered silver. The house rose ahead in dark stone, too large for comfort, windows tall and austere, chimneys breathing thin smoke into a low sky. Footmen waited under the portico. A physician's trap was not among the vehicles. Inside, heat struck hard from banked fires and polished grates. Servants moved quickly and quietly in that particular way of trained households before an important evening. A hall clock marked 4:30. Clara swayed once on her feet as her father set her down. Sandra caught her elbow. The Duke saw it. Nursery. A housekeeper in black wool stepped forward, iron keys at her waist, face composed. Your Grace, the supper preparations require Miss Clara in an hour for dressing. Lady Harbury has already sent word that guests are assembling. Nursery, he repeated. The housekeeper bowed. Yes, Your Grace. Lady Ross arrived in the hall moments later, winded from haste and fury, daughters trailing. She removed her gloves finger by finger, each motion deliberate. Your Grace, this has gone beyond courtesy. My stepdaughter has duties in my home. She cannot be detained because your staff failed at a seam. The Duke did not raise his voice. Your concern is noted. That is not consent. It was not a request. Clara flinched at the rising tension and pressed closer to Sandra. Sandra felt heat through wet silk, not ordinary warmth. Too much. She put the back of her fingers to the child's temple as if adjusting a curl. Hot. She checked again at the throat discreetly, pulse quick and fluttering. Fear tightened under her breastbone. She has fever, Sandra said. Lady Ross snapped. Do not be dramatic. The housekeeper went still. The Duke turned immediately. How high? Sandra met his gaze because precision mattered more than etiquette now. I cannot name numbers without a thermometer, Your Grace, but her skin burns, and her hands are cold. She should be undressed, dried, and cooled at once. No tight stays, no supper assembly. Lady Ross's laugh cracked this time. A laundry girl forbids a duchess's memorial attendance. Remarkable. Sandra did not look at her. If she attends, she may collapse. The housekeeper spoke before anyone else, voice low and practical. The child coughed twice this morning, Your Grace. I sent for Dr. Bell at noon. He has not yet arrived. The Duke's face changed by 1 degree, enough to chill the air. Why was I not told? Your valet said you were in conference with the land agent, and not to be interrupted unless she was dying, he said. The housekeeper lowered her eyes. I judged poorly. Sandra heard the blame gather in the room, each person moving to protect rank and position. Clara swayed again. Sandra did not wait for permission. Miss Clara, with me, she said, and guided the child towards the nursery corridor. Lady Ross stepped directly into her path. You will not touch her. Sandra stopped. Every muscle in her body wanted to retreat from that silk wall and the consequences behind it. Clara's fingers dug harder into her hand. "If I do not touch her now," Sandra said, each word placed carefully, "she may worsen before the physician comes." "You overestimate your value." Sandra lifted her chin the smallest amount. "I am not estimating my value. I am reporting her condition." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the Duke spoke from behind Lady Ross. "Stand aside." Lady Ross turned, outraged. "Your Grace, this girl is insolent, unsanitary, and politically disastrous. If she is seen directing your household on this evening, stand aside." Lady Ross held his gaze, lost, and stepped back with visible effort. Sandra took Clara upstairs. The nursery was warm but close, curtains half drawn against the damp. Toys stood arranged with stiff precision on shelves no child had touched today. A nursemaid hovered, wringing her apron. Sandra gave brisk instructions while unfastening the ruined dress. Dry linen, 2 basins, 1 cool, not cold, 1 warm for hands, flannel cloths. "Clean shift." The nursemaid blinked at her, then looked past her shoulder. The Duke had followed and now stood in the doorway, broad and still, hat removed, wet hair dark at the temples. "Do as she says," he told the nursemaid. Work began at once. Sandra eased Clara out of wet silk and petticoat, checked the repaired seam by habit before setting the gown aside, then wrapped the child in dry linen and sat her upright against pillows. The fever flush climbed from throat to cheekbones. Sandra soaked cloth in cool water, wrung it, laid it at Clara's neck and wrists, changed it as heat gathered. She spoke little at first. Children heard fear in too many words. "Can you drink?" she asked. Clara nodded weakly. Sandra held a cup while she took small swallows. Downstairs, distant sounds rose through the floorboards. Doors opening, silver being laid, carriage arrivals on gravel. Memorial supper would proceed unless the Duke stopped it himself. Sandra knew households like gears. Once set, they ground forward over anything smaller than a title. By the second quarter hour in the nursery, Clara began to shiver despite the heat in her skin. Sandra adjusted again, warming the hands while cooling temples and throat, counting pulse in silence. She asked the nursemaid for willowbark tea, thin and unsweetened, and sent a footman running when none was already prepared. The housekeeper returned with a writing slate to note instructions, eyes fixed on Sandra's hands as if memorizing. Lady Ross entered without knocking, Eliza and Georgina just behind, both in evening silk now, hair dressed for candlelight. The scent of rosewater arrived before the words. "This has become absurd," Lady Ross said. "Guests fill your drawing-room, Your Grace, and we hide in nursery gloom because a girl with raw knuckles has declared herself physician." Sandra did not turn. She changed the cloth at Clara's brow and answered only when she had finished. "Her fever has risen, not fallen." Eliza made a face. "She always flushes when she cries." Clara, eyes half closed, whispered, "I do not want the blue room." Lady Ross seized on it. "Hear that? She speaks clearly. Dress her." Sandra looked directly at Lady Ross for the first time since entering the nursery. "No!" The word came out quiet and firm. It surprised Sandra as much as anyone. Lady Ross stepped closer, fury whitening her mouth. "You forget who feeds you." Sandra felt the old reflex to bow, appease, survive. It moved through her and kept going. "You did not feed me this morning," she said. Silence dropped hard. Georgina actually gasped. The nursemaid froze with folded blanket in her arms. Lady Ross's hand lifted as if by habit towards Sandra's face. The Duke crossed the room in 2 strides and caught Lady Ross's wrist before it descended. His grip was controlled, unyielding. "You will not strike anyone in this house," Lady Ross tried to pull free and could not. "Release me!" He did at once, but his voice remained iron. "You will return downstairs and conduct yourself as a guest or depart as one." She stared at him, breathing fast. "You would choose her word over mine. I choose my daughter's pulse over your convenience." Lady Ross's gaze cut to Sandra, promising debt to be collected later. Sandra returned to the basin and wrung out another cloth with steady hands she didn't feel. Eliza tugged at her mother's sleeve. Georgina looked suddenly uncertain, all earlier mockery gone thin. Lady Ross gathered herself and retreated with brittle grace. At the threshold she turned once more. "Do not imagine this changes your position, Miss Ross." Sandra did not answer. The door closed. Clara stirred and made a small, distressed sound. Sandra leaned close. "I am here." "Read," Clara whispered. "Numbers, the way you did in the carriage." Sandra hesitated, then reached for the nearest slate where nursery expenses were chalked in neat columns by week. Milk, coal, ribbons, sugar, nurse wages, dress trimming, physician retainer. Familiar shapes steadied her. She began in a low voice. £6, 4 shillings, 3 pence for coal in January, £4, 9 shillings in February. Difference £1.15. Clara's breathing slowed by increments. Sandra continued through sums and subtractions, turning accounts into cadence. She did not realise the Duke had come to stand just behind her chair until his shadow crossed the slate. He remained there, unmoving, while she read and cooled and counted and refused to lie about what she saw. An hour passed, then another half. By evening lamps, Clara's skin lost its fierce heat and settled to warm dampness. The shivering eased. Doctor. Bell arrived breathless at last, examined the child and confirmed what Sandra had managed by instinct and discipline. Chill fever from exposure, worsened by distress, not yet in the lungs. Rest, fluids, no public rooms, no tight dressing. He gave the instruction to the Duke and then, after a pause, repeated it to Sandra as if she were part of the order of care. When the physician left, the house quieted in layers. Guests below had been informed that Miss Clara would not appear. Some would call it weakness. Some would call it grief. The supper continued without the child. In the nursery's softened lamplight, Clara slept at last, one hand still curled in the edge of Sandra's apron. Sandra did not attempt to free it. Her back ached. Her cut knuckles had reopened from wringing cloth and now stung in the drying air. She sat very still and watched the rise and fall of the child's chest. Behind her the Duke spoke for the first time in many minutes. "You disobeyed your guardian in public." "Twice!" Sandra kept her eyes on Clara. "Yes, Your Grace. You contradicted her in my hall." "Yes. You refused to dress my daughter for the supper." "Yes." A long pause followed. She could hear only the nursery clock and distant murmur from lower floors. At last he said, "Good." She turned then, startled despite herself. He stood near the door, coat removed, shirt sleeves rolled to forearm, as if he had forgotten formality entirely. Face drawn with fatigue he had not permitted anyone else to see. Candlelight caught the scar at his jaw and made it look less like menace, more like old pain, poorly healed. He met her gaze and spoke in the same controlled tone, but the words altered the room. "You will remain with her tonight." The words struck Sandra harder than any rebuke Lady Ross had ever given, not for their tone, but for their certainty. Remain, not request, not courtesy. A transfer of command spoken as if the world had already adjusted around it. She rose from the nursery chair with care, easing Clara's fingers from her apron one at a time so the child did not wake. "Your Grace, I cannot remain without Lady Ross's permission." He did not move from the doorway. Lamplight held the angles of his face in hard relief. the old scar pale against shadow. You can. You will. If I do not return tonight, she will dismiss Mrs. Pike or the kitchen maid or any person who cannot refuse her. His gaze sharpened. You believe she will punish others for your absence? She has done so before. The nursery clock clicked through 4 small beats. He absorbed that without visible surprise, as if he had expected the answer and wished to hear her name it aloud. Then he stepped into the room and lowered his voice so it would not carry beyond Clara's bed. She will not touch my staff. She will not touch yours. Not tonight. Sandra wrapped her stinging hands together to hide their tremor. With respect, Your Grace, you cannot govern what occurs in another house. I can govern what occurs when that house depends upon blackthorn contracts for coal, grain transport, and winter credit. His eyes stayed on her face. Do not mistake restraint for lack of reach. The statement landed with the force of a door closing behind her. She had known he was powerful. Harrogate measured itself against Blackthorn rents and Blackthorn road repairs and Blackthorn charity subscriptions at church. Knowing it in the abstract had been one thing. Hearing him use that weight for her safety was another, and it made her chest tighten in a way she did not trust. Your Grace, she said carefully, if you mean to keep me here, the house will speak. The house already speaks. His jaw set. It has spoken since the draper's floor when Lady Ross gripped your wrist in front of 30 witnesses. She looked down at the red marks, darkening now along the bone. Shame burned hot and immediate. He had seen. Everyone had seen. He seemed to read that thought and gave it no softness. Look at me, she obeyed. You did not disgrace yourself today. She did. Something inside her gave one painful shift. She had endured years of being told the opposite, with polished confidence, and legal phrases and smiles for guests. A single blunt sentence should not have felt like relief. It did. From the corridor came the muted sound of steps. The housekeeper appeared at the threshold, posture precise, keys still at her waist. Your Grace. Mrs. Davies, he said, never taking his eyes from Sandra. Miss Ross remains in the nursery suite tonight. Prepare the small adjoining chamber, fire, hot water, clean linens, and a tray. Mrs. Davies hesitated only once. Yes, Your Grace. Shall I send one of the upper maids to attend her? No. His answer was immediate. No one disturbs this floor without my order. The housekeeper's gaze flicked to Sandra's raw knuckles, then away. At once, Your Grace. When she had gone, silence returned, close and heavy with heat from the nursery grate. Clara sighed in sleep and turned her cheek deeper into the pillow. Sandra listened to that small sound before she trusted herself to speak again. This is too much for a torn seam and one fever. His expression did not change. This is for my daughter. She waited. The room held still. Then he added, lower, and for what I saw. Her pulse gave one hard beat against her throat. What did you see? He moved to the chair opposite Clara's bed, but did not sit. His hand rested on its carved back, fingers spread, as if stillness cost effort. I saw you obey every order that shamed you until the child needed you. Then you disobeyed without hesitation. Sandra could not answer. I saw Lady Ross speak of you as property while you kept your voice level. His eyes dropped briefly to her cuff, stiff where old blood and rain had dried. I saw you working while you were hungry enough to shake. She felt the tremor return at once, as if his naming had granted it permission. He continued, each phrase measured. I saw you in this room cooling my daughter's fever while my own household looked to rank before sense. I heard you recite nursery ledgers from memory to calm a child no one had fed properly since noon. He paused. Candlelight threw a clean line across his cheekbone. The rest of him shadowed and severe. You were not performing for reward. You thought no one was watching. The truth of it stripped her bare in a way humiliation never had. She had worked for years behind doors, in alcoves, in the narrow spaces where women like her became invisible. She had made herself small to survive. Being seen now, precisely and without ornament, felt like standing in winter air, with no cloak at all. She forced her hands to uncurl. I did what was necessary. Yes, a muscle shifted once in his jaw. That is why you remain. By the time Mrs. Davies returned, the nursery fire had burned lower and the lamplight had softened to amber. 2 maids carried in a copper can of steaming water, folded linens, and a tray covered with a cloth. The chamber next door smelled of beeswax and clean wool. It was simple by Blackthorn standards, yet larger than Sandra's attic room at Ross House, with a proper bed, a washstand, and a narrow writing table near the window. Mrs. Davies stood aside while the maids set the tray down. Broth, bread, cold chicken and tea, Miss Ross. There is also salve for your hands. Sandra swallowed, uncertain where to place gratitude in a room she did not belong to. Thank you. The housekeeper gave the smallest nod. If you need anything, pull the bell once. The Duke spoke from behind them. She pulls it twice. Once is too easily ignored. Mrs. Davies straightened further, chastened though he had not raised his voice. Twice, then, Your Grace. After they left, Sandra remained standing by the table, unable for a moment to cross the threshold into food and heat and temporary safety, as if she had earned any of it. The Duke stood in the doorway between chambers, one hand against the frame, gaze angled toward Clara's bed where the child slept with damp curls stuck to her temple. You have not eaten enough, he said. She gave a tired, almost bitter exhale. You have developed a habit of issuing true statements as commands. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Gone before she could be certain it had existed. Eat, he said. She sat and did. Slowly this time. Broth first, then bread softened in it, then tea to settle the sharp ache in her stomach. Heat returned to her fingertips in painful pins. The salve stung before it soothed. Through the open door she could see him still where he had been, unchanged except for the angle of his head as he watched Clara breathe. He had not sat. She finished half the tray before speaking. Your Grace, you should rest. You have guests below. I dismissed them. She looked up quickly. All of them? Yes. For a fever, that, doctor. Bell called manageable. For my daughter. His answer came flat and final. Then, after a beat, and because I will not host people who call a frightened child decorative and think that memory qualifies as affection. Sandra lowered her eyes to the table. The memorial supper had been for his dead wife. The house had arranged flowers and silver and public grief on schedule. He had ended it with one instruction. The reach of that decision was large enough to disturb half the county by morning. She set down her spoon. Lady Ross will call this manipulation. Lady Ross may call it weather, if she prefers. His tone remained cold. It alters nothing. The nursery clock marked another quarter hour. Outside, wind brushed the window panes with a faint, dry sound as the last damp lifted from the night. In the corridor, a board creaked, then settled. No one entered. Sandra rose to check Clara again, crossing quietly to the bed. The fever had broken to a low warmth. She adjusted the blanket and touched the child's wrist. Steadier now. Relief eased through her in a slow unwinding she had no strength left to hide. When she turned, she found him watching not Clara, but her hands. You count pulse correctly, he said. My father taught me stock management, she answered before caution caught up. Sick foals, carving, winter chills, numbers first, panic later. He leaned one shoulder to the frame, eyes narrowing with thought. Your father taught you more than stitching. Yes, estate arithmetic. The words were not a question. She felt her spine go taut. Some. I heard your ledger cadence, coal variances by month, wage discrepancies. You recited without searching. He held her gaze. Who trained you to remember columns that way? She should have deflected. She should have offered modesty and silence and any answer that kept hidden things hidden. Exhaustion made honesty easier than strategy. My father sat me beside him when his clerk fell ill one harvest. I copied lease figures to keep pace. He corrected me when I rounded sums. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. He said if you let one false number stand, it invites 10 more. The Duke's expression altered by a fraction, less flint, more weight. He was right. They stood in shared quiet, separated by rank and doorway and every law that had arranged their lives long before this night. Yet the quiet was not empty. It was charged, attentive, and strangely even. At last, Sandra said what had pressed against her tongue since the hall. If I remain here, she will claim you have taken me to spite her. She has already begun. He looked back toward Clara. Claims are cheap. Records are not. The phrase struck her with recognition so sharp she almost stepped back. Records! Her hidden notebook beneath the attic board seemed to rise before her eyes. Tenant rents, missing wages, altered totals. Proof not yet sufficient for court, but proof of pattern. He turned back. How long have you been keeping account? She did not pretend confusion. Months. Where? She hesitated. His stare did not soften. It did not threaten either. It demanded precision. In my attic room. Hidden. Yes. What kind of records? Tenant payments received and not posted. Wage rolls marked paid and not delivered. Lease arrears listed where coin was collected. Coal tallies that change between drafts. He listened without interruption. No flicker of surprise. Only that same still concentration she had seen in the draper's workroom when the shears first touched silk. Can you retrieve them? He asked. Not tonight. Lady Ross will lock the upper passage if she suspects. I do not ask for tonight. His voice lowered. I ask if they exist. They exist. He looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again the words were slower, each one chosen for permanence. You are not returning to Lady Ross. The room seemed to contract around the sentence. Sandra heard the blood in her ears, the nursery clock, Clara's quiet breath. She heard too the legal and social rupture inside those 7 words. A woman in her position did not step out from one household into another without permission, contract, scandal, or marriage. Usually all 4. She kept her own voice steady by force. On what authority, Your Grace? Mine. He straightened from the frame. Until the magistrate reviews guardianship and wage claims. Until your records are secured. Until my daughter is well. He took one step closer, then stopped at a careful distance, as if aware of the very boundary he was crossing with language alone. Stay. Command, protection, no gentling, no apology. Yet under it she heard what he would never phrase as plea. Do not leave her. Do not leave this house to lies. Do not vanish back into rooms where harm is called discipline. Sandra held his gaze and felt the old training pull her toward obedience, and the newer, harder part of herself resist being transferred like inventory. She thought of Lady Ross's hand at her wrist in public. She thought of Clara burning with fever and whispering for numbers. She thought of her father, ink-stained thumb, saying false columns collapse roofs. If I stay, she said at last, each word clear, I stay as contracted labour with defined duties. Wage entered in writing, and my records surrendered to the magistrate, not buried in household discretion. No shock crossed his face. Crossed, if anything, a bleak respect. Done? Mrs. Pike and the kitchen maid at Ross House are not dismissed in reprisal. Done. I am not hidden upstairs as embarrassment. His answer came without delay. You will work in the estate office. The force of that nearly undid her more than any kindness might have. Office, not attic, not corridor shadows. She inclined her head once, formal because anything less would have broken. Then I will stay tonight. His shoulders lowered by one small measure, the first visible release she had seen from him since the arcade. He stepped back into the nursery proper, and at last sat in the chair beside Clara's bed. He did not remove his gaze from his sleeping daughter. He did not speak again. Sandra returned to the adjoining chamber, washed her hands in cooling water, and wrapped them in clean linen with the salve Mrs. Davies had left. When she came back to the nursery doorway, he was still there, broad frame motionless in the lamplight, one hand resting near but not on the child's blanket, as if touch itself required permission from sleep. By the time the hall clock below marked midnight, he had not moved from that chair once. The nursery clock turned 1, then 2, and still he sat beside Clara's bed, broad shoulders bowed only by fatigue, not by surrender, while Sandra stood in the doorway between the two rooms and understood that the night had already crossed the point where her old life could be resumed by habit alone. By dawn, pale light had reached the nursery curtains, and Clara woke without heat in her skin, blinking at the room as if surfacing from deep water. Dr. Bell returned at first call, smelled of wet wool and camphor, and set his fingers to pulse and throat with brisk precision. "Improved," he said. "No chest rattle. Broth at noon. Bed rest through tomorrow. No visitors who excite tears." He turned to the Duke. "Whoever managed cooling in the first hours prevented a worse turn." The Duke inclined his head towards Sandra, and Dr. Bell gave her a short, formal bow that treated her as colleague rather than accident. Clara drank from the cup Sandra held and whispered, "Will you leave now?" Sandra brushed damp curls from her brow. "I will go where your care requires." Clara looked toward her father, then back. "Then require it." The Duke's scar pulled faintly as his jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "You are heard." In the corridor outside, Mrs. Davies waited with keys at her waist and a folded note in her hand. "Your Grace, the parish magistrate can attend within the hour. Mr." Hale was already at his office. She hesitated. "Lady Ross has sent 2 messages demanding Miss Ross be returned at once." The Duke took the note and didn't open it. No reply. He looked to Sandra. "You will come to the estate office after you eat." She answered as she had promised in the night, "I will, under the terms stated." "And in writing," he said, "before noon." The office at Blackthorn stood off the West Hall, high shelves, iron deed box, coal fire burning steady. Sandra had never entered a room where accounts were treated as architecture, not afterthought. The steward, Mr. Ellery, waited with 3 ledgers open, ink stand ready, spectacles low on his nose. He glanced at Sandra's bandaged hands, and then deliberately moved a chair for her to the table itself, not behind it. That small gesture nearly undid her more than any speech. At 9:30, Magistrate Hale arrived in dark coat and parish seal, accompanied by a constable and 2 witnesses from town trade. Lady Ross arrived 4 minutes later, in travelling silk, Eliza and Georgina behind her, faces pale from anger and poor sleep. Lady Ross did not sit. "This is outrageous! Miss Ross is my legal dependent, removed without consent and held in a house where she has no standing." She looked directly at Sandra. "You will come now." Sandra kept her hands on the table edge so they would not shake. I will not. Lady Ross's eyes flashed. You ungrateful girl. The Duke did not rise, but the room altered around him anyway. Address her as Miss Ross, he said, or you may address the constable from the drive. Magistrate Hale cleared his throat. We will proceed by record. Lady Ross, you assert guardianship and financial propriety. Miss Ross asserts coercion, withheld wages, and falsified household accounts affecting tenancies and staff payments. His Grace's household physician confirms visible injury consistent with repeated handling. Lady Ross gave a brittle laugh. Now my discipline is criminal. Hale didn't answer that. He held out his hand towards Sandra. Miss Ross, you claim you keep independent figures. Where are they? Sandra felt the attic floorboard under her knees as if she were back there in darkness. Hidden in my room at Ross House. The Duke spoke to the constable. Escort Miss Ross, Mrs. Davies, and Mr. Ellery's clerk. Retrieve the notebook and any wage rolls in current use. No private rummaging, only named records. Lady Ross stepped forward. You have no warrant. Hale lifted a folded paper from his case and broke the wax in front of them all. Now we do. Temporary writ for financial review and welfare protection, signed this morning. Lady Ross went very still, then smiled without warmth. A temporary writ is not conviction. No, Hale said, it is entry. The return to Ross House happened under grey noon light and public attention she could feel along the lane. Mrs. Pike opened the side door before they knocked, eyes red-rimmed, apron immaculate despite it. She looked once at Sandra, a look she had given for years and never spent on words, and moved aside. Attic first, Sandra said, before anyone can claim misplacement. They climbed the narrow stair where winter draughts had once cut through cracked frame. The room had been searched, blanket thrown back, trunk open, one chair overturned. Sandra knelt, slid her fingers under the loose board, and found only splinters and emptiness. For one breath she could not hear anything at all. Then Mrs. Pike spoke from the doorway, voice low. I moved it at dawn when I heard Lady Ross order the housemaid to burn waste papers from this floor. She reached into her basket beneath folded toweling and drew out the muslin-wrapped notebook, tied with kitchen twine. I judged you would come with law, not alone. Sandra took it with both hands, as if it were bone from her father's hand. You saved it! Mrs. Pike's mouth trembled once and set again. I saved what I could. They gathered the current wage roll from the pantry office, 2 estate rent books from Lady Ross's locked escritoire under constable witness, and from a disused cabinet in the morning room, Sandra's mother's portrait wrapped in old dust sheets, varnish dulled but intact. The pearl comb lay in the same drawer, one carved tooth cracked, still recognisable. Sandra touched the comb once and put it back in its case. Some recoveries needed ceremony later, not this stairwell urgency. Eliza watched from the passage and said nothing. Georgina looked at the portrait, then away. Neither sister offered explanation, and by the time the party left, neither had. Back at Blackthorn, records opened across the long table like a battlefield mapped in ink. Mr. Ellery's clerk read entries aloud from Lady Ross's ledgers. Sandra answered from memory, then from her notebook, line for line, date for date. North lease, Mrs. Colton, paid 10 days before notice of arrears. Recorded unpaid in household copy, paid in tenant receipt book. Call variance inflated in nursery budget by £1.15 in February. Difference transferred to discretionary column marked morning expenses. Hale marked each discrepancy with red pencil. By late afternoon, the pattern had stopped being allegation and become structure. Wages withheld from 3 maids and 2 grooms. Rents diverted. Duplicate creditor payments used to justify asset seizure. Mrs. Pike testified to meal withholding and physical correction in public spaces. The kitchen maid, trembling, confirmed missed wages and threats of dismissal if she spoke. Lady Ross stood through all of it, gloved hands clasped tight enough to whiten the knuckles. This is bookkeeping confusion made theatrical by a resentful girl and a grieving duke. Hale set down his pencil. No, this is fraud and coercive control under household authority. He folded the pages, affixed seal, and looked to the constable. Execute removal under writ. Lady Ross is to vacate Blackthorn at once and remain available to parish inquiry. Interim guardianship over Miss Ross is suspended pending final review. Miss Ross is of age and free to contract. Lady Ross turned on Sandra at last, voice stripped of polish. You think this house will keep you when novelty fades? Sandra felt the old fear rise and pass through her without finding purchase. I think records endure longer than moods. The constable opened the door. Lady Ross left with lifted chin and no audience left willing to pretend. When the corridor quieted, the Duke crossed to the table and placed Blackthorn's principal estate ledger in front of Sandra. His hand remained on the cover a moment, then lifted. Take Blackthorn, all of it, if you will keep my daughter safe. The room held its breath. Sandra's fingers trembled once over the leather and stilled. I will not be taken with it, she said. No ownership disguised as gratitude. Contract, authority defined, accounts transparent, and my name entered where decisions are recorded. His answer came without pause. Yes. Joint signing power with the steward. Yes. Staff wages posted publicly each quarter. Yes. She met his eyes. Then I accept as estate steward. 3 days later, in the parish registry under clear cold light, Hale witnessed the correction entries himself. Sandra Ross, lawful daughter of the late Mr. Ross, was restored to property records attached to her mother's settled portion, previously concealed under household transfer claims now voided. The joint trust deed for Blackthorn lands followed. Operational authority vested in the Duke and Miss Ross as steward, with protections for tenant contracts and wage schedules written in plain language, not ornamental law. Clara, wrapped in blue wool and fully recovered, sat at the end of the table swinging one shoe and announced to no one in particular, now no one may steal coal from my nursery again. Mr. Ellery coughed into his fist to hide what might have been relief. The marriage came in the chapel at Blackthorn before winter's end, not as rescue, not as purchase, but as an amendment to terms already honoured. Sandra stood in dove-grey wool, her mother's portrait rehung in the west hall that morning, where household and guests could see what had been erased and returned. The pearl comb held her dark hair in place, despite the cracked tooth. When the vicar asked for consent, she gave it in a clear voice that carried to the back pew, where Mrs. Pike stood, with both hands folded tight. The Duke answered in the same clipped certainty he used for every binding promise. Afterward, no one shouted, no orchestra swelled, no miracle interrupted ordinary weather. Clara took Sandra's hand on the chapel steps, and the Duke took her other, and they walked down together into a courtyard where wages had been posted on the board at dawn. Tenant receipts were signed on time, and the ledgers in the estate office bore 3 names on the authority line instead of 1.